It's my great pleasure to welcome to Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government tonight the Pollock Lecturer for 1987, the United States' second longest-serving Secretary of Defense, Caspar Willard Weinberger. Secretary Weinberger has many distinctions, but in a university that tends to believe that everything happens here, I'll reveal one of the less well-known facts, namely that he's one of the few people who participated both in Harvard's 350th anniversary celebrations last year and 50 years earlier in Harvard's tercentenary celebrations. Even more remarkable, in the first case, he has allowed me to confess that he was a reporter for the Crimson, of which he later served as president, and is credited with the Crimson lead on the 1936 celebrations, which began, quote, as Harvard enters its fourth century. Pretty good prose. The Pollock Lecturer on Research and Government was created in 1954 here at the school with the goal of, quote, stimulating interest in government careers and research and thus building a better government, close quote. Recent Pollock lecturers have included former Secretary of Defense Jim Schlesinger, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Pat Harris, and former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Secretary Weinberger's own career offers inspiration and insight for students here at Harvard today. After Harvard College and Harvard Law School, he returned to his native San Francisco, where he quickly became a partner of a well-known law firm, but that was really his sidelight. He entered the California State Assembly, which he served in for 3 terms. He then served as Governor Reagan's Director of Finance and hosted a weekly television program interviewing political figures on state and local government. In both roles, namely Director of Finance and the host of this program, he had succeeded Hale Champion, sometimes Executive Dean here at the school. In 1969, Cap Weinberger went to Washington as chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. His reorganization of the FTC, about which we have a case here at the school, so impressed President Nixon that he was named deputy director and then director of the Office of Management and Budget. From there, he went on to be secretary of HEW, where he earned the nickname Cap the Knife. From 1975 to 1980, he returned to California as general counsel and vice president of the Bechtel Corporation. A close advisor of presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, he was one of the first persons named to the Reagan cabinet, where he served as Secretary of Defense until November 23rd. Assessing his performance in a 7-year tenure from this long perspective of 10 days would be both premature and hazardous, even here at Harvard. Nonetheless, I'll try to identify several of the key issues about which historians of this period will argue in the future. Weinberger supporters will no doubt emphasize achievements in 3 areas: personnel, funding, and advising. His success in attracting and retaining first-class people with high morale in an all-volunteer military has astounded skeptics and supporters alike. So also his role in sustaining the longest series of real annual increases in the defense budget since World War II. And most importantly, fans will recall his success in performing what one of his predecessors, Robert McNamara, identified in a forum event here 2 weeks ago as, quote, the most important role any Secretary of Defense plays, namely advising the President about decisions to use military force, close quote. What about his critics? They're likely to counter with charges of profligacy, poor management, and a disregard for the economic foundations of security. Congressman Les Aspin, a member of the school's visiting committee, now famous quote will be repeated, quote, Cap never saw a weapon system he didn't like, close quote. As well as more serious charges about the extent to which each service was allowed to pursue its own priorities and strategy. Or James Reston's charge in a recent column that Secretary Weinberger, quote, never saw any relationship between his defense expenditures and the budget deficit, close quote. Even his harshest critics will be forced to applaud one strand in the Weinberger legacy. As the Boston Globe editorialized recently, quote, Weinberger's greatest contribution to U.S. security was his sense that U.S. forces should not be sent willy-nilly into combat in third world trouble spots. His guidelines governing the commitment of U.S. forces could be Caspar Weinberger's legacy when the last MX or B-1 has turned to dust, close quote. Through a half-century since he graduated from the college, including his tenure as Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger has been among Harvard's most loyal alumni. Thus, while we're not surprised, we're especially gratified that he chose this forum for his first public address since leaving office. Secretary Weinberger. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you very much, Graham. That's a very generous, very nice introduction. With respect to the last few paragraphs, I'm inclined to say I can explain everything, but I don't think anybody wants to hear explanations. But I would say, parenthetically, at the beginning, that one of the very fine volunteers whom we were able to attract to Washington, of course, was Graham Allison, who served as an unofficial and then later an official advisor and consultant to the department and gave us very fine advice, not all of which we always followed, but very fine advice and very fine help and very fine stimulation of new thinking. So that is a great pleasure indeed to have the opportunity to be back here. And I am delighted indeed to see so many of my classmates here. It's kind of a preliminary to a most improbable reunion, which I think is continue to believe is a statistical error. I can't possibly be 50 years, but I was very forcibly reminded of that when Graham, with an unnecessary statistical reference, I thought, called attention to the fact that I had participated in the tercentenary in a very minor way, and then again in the 350th, and it leads one to all kinds of unreasonable ambitions with respect to the 400th anniversary of Harvard. I'm told always and believe firmly that one should never start with an apology, and so I don't plan to do that, but I think an explanation may be in order. You have been summoned here tonight on the assumption and with the suggestion that I was going to talk about the problems of following conventional wisdom. Actually, that was this afternoon. Tonight I did plan to talk more about the various tests that I thought should be utilized before we committed American forces to combat. And I will be glad to make up for any unusual disappointment on the fact of anybody, on the part of anybody here in the audience, by trying to deal with the other subject in response to questions. I should warn you, however, that it takes about 45 minutes. Nevertheless, with respect to the uses of military power, which was basically the title of a talk I made about 3 years ago, I think some may remember it the best for the fact that I set out, or tried to set out, 6 tests which I postulated should be used to govern the use and the commitment of American combat forces to battle. These tests, I think, can be summarized essentially as saying that before we commit our forces to combat, our government should first determine that our vital interests are at stake, that it is a cause that is vital enough to ask men and women to die, and that the issues involved are important for us and for our future, and so important that we're prepared to commit sufficient forces to win, to secure a favorable outlook, and favorable outcome, rather, I should say, that we've clearly defined and have before us clearly defined political and military objectives which we must secure, and that we have sized our forces properly to achieve these objectives. And that's an extremely important point, which I think I might try to develop a little later, that we have some reasonable assurance of the support of the American people. This does not require that we read a Gallup poll every morning, but some reasonable assurance of the support of the American people. And finally, that American forces are committed to combat only as a last resort, after everything else has failed. Diplomatic, political, economic, all other means have failed. That then it is, and only then, proper to commit our forces to combat and ask this potential final sacrifice of men and women. And so I thought I'd like to re-examine some of those tests to see if they're still applicable or if they're applicable at all to the world situation that we see today. We've entered an era when the dividing lines between peace and war are a lot less clearly drawn than they used to be. Probably a lot less clearly drawn than they've been ever before. Our allies and ourselves now face a whole spectrum of threats, from overt military attacks all the way down to a variety of lesser but equally dangerous activities, including covert action against us, internal subversion, pressure, intimidation, and terrorism. And to protect the security and our national interests against this spectrum of threats, we have to respond appropriately across this whole spectrum. And I believe these 6 tests really offer a way to frame possible responses. The tests that I suggested are not related just to potential threats of today, but they were an attempt to try to deal with the basic nature of our democratic system. They're indeed a message of caution. They emphatically do not represent an isolationist mood, as some have charged. They do not question our willingness to intervene militarily around the world when these tests are met, but they point clearly to basically the real question. And the real question is when and under what circumstances should American forces intervene, be asked to give up their lives, and how can our intervention be effective? And it's vital to understand, I think, the relationship between diplomacy and military power. The administration's restoration of the strength of our military forces has been for the explicit purpose of demonstrating the power and the will to protect our security and our interests and to discourage other parties from threatening those interests by heightening their understanding of our ability to retaliate. Phrased another way, I think the proper way to say it really is that by building strong military forces and demonstrating that we're willing to do that and make the political and the economic and other effort that's required to do that, we believe we have reduced the possibility that these forces will ever have to be used. And that is the paradox of deterrence and why it is so absolutely vital that we keep our forces strong. We've demonstrated in the past that when our vital interests or those of our allies are threatened, we are ready to use force and use it decisively. And we, of course, must continue to do that. But we've also erred in the past by being sometimes unwilling to use sufficient force to achieve our objectives, or our objectives have not been clear enough, or not vitally necessary to our survival as a nation. Too often we've gone with too little and too late, and there are a lot of misguided notions, I'm afraid, about measured responses and gradual escalation, and a dangerously wrong idea that any American presence, however small, could accomplish something. And I think all of that contributed in important ways to the failures not only in Vietnam, but to the Iranian rescue. When a decision is made to use military force, I think it is absolutely essential to achieve the objective as rapidly as possible. In short, if it's vital enough, if that objective is vital enough to use American force and to use American combat forces, then it is vital enough for us to win. And I've always believed that when and if it is concluded that military strength has to be used, and it's the last resort and everything else has failed, then it should be used with overwhelming force against a narrow front to achieve our goals as quickly and as expeditiously and as effectively as possible with the least possible loss. Well, bringing it down home, so to speak, to today, let's look about what we're doing in the Persian Gulf. Is that a good case? I think it's a good case in point. There are many who have charged recently that the progression of events suggests merely that the United States is being drawn gradually into a combat role. No, I don't think this is true. We're not in a combat role now, and I believe that if we were not there, if we look at it the other way, if we were not there, escorting non-belligerent shipping, keeping international waters open, preserving freedom of navigation, all of which have been our goals since our formation as a nation, then I think the Gulf would become rather soon, if we didn't do those things, a monument to Iranian intimidation and indiscriminate attacks on innocent, non-belligerent shipping, in this case carrying very important cargoes. This shipping is vitally important to the United States, and it certainly is vitally important, more important on a mathematical, statistical basis to our allies. And these attacks, if left without a response, I think wouldn't not only hurt us at home in a very obvious, quick way, but would lead quite rapidly to a situation in which we would have to use really very active military measures in a much more difficult situation to prevent economic and other damage to the West. So I think our activities in the Gulf are designed to prevent our being brought into or drawn into what otherwise would be a combat role. Of course, no military action is risk-free, and we understand and accept the fact that there are risks. There is no way in which a policy of any kind of leadership or any kind of deterrent capability of trying to keep the peace can be conducted without some risk. By all definitions, the Persian Gulf and the traffic through it, however, represent an area of vital interest to the United States security. The first test, so to speak, would easily be met. We've had forces in the Gulf designed to carry out our policy of ensuring freedom of the seas and freedom to pass freely over international waters since at least 1949. The number and the size and the type of the forces required at any given time varies with the threats of our basic policy. For many years, we were there with 4 ships, 3 ships and an occasional replacement. At the moment, the challenge is greater, and so larger forces, which are now there, are indeed required to keep and maintain and achieve the same objectives we've always had in mind. It's the threat that's increased, not the change of objectives. And we can't turn away from the Gulf, I think, because of any presumed Iranian challenge. We can't say that the risk is too great. We have demonstrated that we are indeed capable of taking actions against Iran that are not quite as limited as some expressed earlier. We have left a calling card, so to speak, but we'd prefer not to come for a visit. And we think what we're doing helps preclude that. Well, then there are other examples of the use of force in which the policies I tried to outline in that talk are applicable. We made airstrikes against Libya, and American force was used there decisively to send an unmistakable message, an unmistakable signal that clearly established that terrorism has its own very high cost to those who practice or support it. Terrorism that is indeed clearly established as such, and where the blame and where the aggressors, where the perpetrators are clearly known. The decision to use force in that case was reached with reluctance by the President. Sending Americans into harm's way is never an easy decision, and it's particularly not if you have the responsibility for the safety and lives of those troops, which I did. And when you contemplate the use of force, I think we have to be prepared to deal with a whole range of possibilities, a spectrum of crises from a lone terrorist strike to a global war. We have in place now the strategy to accomplish this, whether we're combating proven terrorist acts, as was the case in Libya, or whether we're employing conventional forces as a last resort to rescue 1,000 American students in really very grave peril in a totally anarchical situation in Grenada, and then restore a democratic government as we did there, and then leave. So each situation has to be examined very carefully and has to be very carefully evaluated. The lives of our men in arms are a very precious commodity. And unfortunately, many who do not have the responsibilities for leading and nurturing them always seem to be far more willing to risk their lives than those of us who have that responsibility. Well, we have very important interests in third world nations. We must make intelligent use of all of our instruments of power, and diplomatic and economic, as well as security measures, so that we can avoid, wherever possible, the involvement of U.S. forces in direct combat. This is nothing we seek. Our policies are designed to prevent conditions that could require or lead to the commitment of American troops unnecessarily or hastily. Now, that policy is not, and our policy should not, ever be isolationist. We should never be so weak or so foolish. Obviously, we must seek to avoid also indecisive and ineffective intervention, which, among other things, could lead us back into the fatal attractions of isolationism. Never again, people would say, must we ever get into anything like that. The results were too bad. We never again, some people say, should take anything that even has a risk of that. Well, I think that we should never again commit men to combat and ask them to hazard their lives when we do not intend to win. And our society needs to think a lot more about the variety of threats that we face, the necessity to employ the varieties of our power that are available to us, to have those varieties available, and to respond to some threats, perhaps with covert action, to respond to others with some use of force, all consistent with the mission and with the clear principle that we have to have this clearly defined national security objective, the success of which is vital to our nation. And that then we apply, if those conditions are satisfied, all of the force necessary to achieve these objectives, which by definition are really vital to our survival. Our plans for the use of military forces and other elements of national power must recognize, as they do, that the United States, as the world's defender of freedom, is constrained. It's the fate of defenders who have no aggressive plans or no aggressive agenda, who do not seek any more real estate or any attacks on anyone. It's their fate that we must always be that we always must understand that under those circumstances we do not and cannot choose the time and place or the method of attack. And in military parlance, that's a substantial advantage to cede, to give up. We must, as a result, always be prepared to meet a very wide range of contingencies. And we must also be able to choose the level and the means with which we face the inevitable threats that confront us. And a lot of people have said that this really shows that we don't have any priorities, that we want to be everywhere at once. What it shows really is that we don't have all that much choice, that we have to respond to the levels of attacks that may be launched against us and the different kinds of attacks, anywhere. And we have to be ready all the time. The readiness level has to be much higher than it has been in the past, and that is a very expensive proposition. So seeking to contain the level of a potential conflict requires, among other things, active measures of aid and assistance and training to our friends that may deter, and we believe will deter conflict. In many ways, it's the most cost-effective part of our defense, and yet it is in many ways the most difficult to persuade the Congress to support. It is one of the ways of making deterrence credible at all levels. And in choosing these active measures, we should seek to, I think, reduce in every way we can the causes of conflict, political, economic, social, before they lead to armed conflict. Clausewitz noted that the first and the supreme and the most far-reaching act of judgment that statesmen and commanders have to establish is that the kind of war on which they are embarking, they must know what that is. They must neither mistake it for nor try to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. And so I think we must recognize the nature and the magnitude of a growing number of independent threats, which, if we don't deal with them effectively on their own terms, surely will create conditions that the Soviet Union or some other adversary could exploit to place the free world at great disadvantage. Well, to meet these threats successfully in the future, I think we must make much more sophisticated use of the many elements of our power which we now have at our disposal, and which we have to have. These elements of power are diplomatic, economic, moral tools of the nation, and these can support and complement the application to military force. And they must always, under my feeling, come first, before we even talk about military forces. We always must bear in mind that power can be employed without resorting to force. In the words of Sun Tzu, those skilled in war subdue their enemy's army without battle. So we can win without fighting, and we always should whenever we can. In the third world, it will become increasingly vital to respond to future instability with the political and economic instruments of national power. It'll be critical to seek out the root causes of instability and conflict before they lead to armed conflict and to the requirement of the involvement of American troops. Relatively small increases in economic aid and training and security assistance and nation-building activities can pay very long-range dividends for the growth of democracy and world stability and peace. We can demonstrate mathematically that they are good for America economically, and we know that they are extraordinarily difficult to get through the Congress, any year, any party. Year after year, the Congress practices what I believe is basically the false economy of cutting our requests for these military and economic assistance funds so that they can continue basically economically unnecessary or economically false programs that enable increases to be made in politically popular domestic spending. Well, then there's another level, the level of guerrilla warfare. At that level, security assistance may be the very best means of helping protect a regime while it pursues courses that eventually could lead to an improved climate of rights and election and an equitable system of laws. On our own, we can compete easily with shovels and win. Our adversaries require guns. It's a very instructive difference, I think. By far the greatest share of our assistance to the lesser developed nations now is in economic aid, pretty well over 2/3. And the greater share of our security assistance when we do military assistance is the so-called non-lethal aid. The Soviets offer relatively little in economic foreign aid. Almost all of their aid is arms. And this is the type of competitive strategy that Graham Allison has pioneered and helped us to institutionalize in Washington now, which means basically exploiting our inherent advantages at the expense of Soviet weaknesses. And this is the kind of thing I think we should do actively and actively promote. We have to help nations and people fighting for their freedom. We have to help those people help themselves. Ordinarily, we cannot and we should not substitute our troops or our will for theirs. At the same time, the United States must at all costs avoid trying to Americanize conflicts if a perceived client-state relationship of the United States with the oppressed would cause some loss of the freedom fighters' legitimacy with their own peoples. It is both a cliche and a truth that it is in the hearts and minds of oppressed peoples that the battles must be won. So my caution on the use of military forces is intentional. The world has an endless array of potential conflicts in which we might conceivably play a useful role. The theory that the mere presence, however, of American troops in numbers insufficient to defeat aggressors, that mere presence might make some slight difference, is not enough for our government to ask young men and women to risk their lives. And the fact that a limited United States presence might provide some limited diplomatic leverage is not enough to ask our troops to be ready to die. I think we have to learn from the tragic loss of life in Beirut. We were asked there to have an American force as part of an international military group interpose itself between withdrawing armies, the Syrians and the Israelis. Unfortunately, of course, the withdrawal agreement was never signed, was never entered into. So the international force could never do what it was sized and what it was tasked to do. Their mission required them to be and to be recognized as peacekeepers. We knew that if conditions deteriorated as they did, so that they were in danger, and if because of the actions of warring nations or the anarchical tribes which roam all over Lebanon, that their peacekeeping mission could not be realized, we knew then it would be necessary either to add sufficiently to the number of our troops and equip them for combat to defeat any enemy, any kind of contingency there, or to withdraw them. And it's a deep tragedy that we did not get them out before terrorism killed so many. Well, according to the doctrines developed in the 50s and early 60s, limited war was essentially a diplomatic instrument. It was a tool for bargaining with the enemy. As such, it had to be centrally directed by the political leadership. It had to be applied with very precise controls. The gradual application of American force was what was talked about, and that was combined with a threat of escalation to the next step up the ladder. And according to these theorists, that would persuade America's opponents to accept a settlement while they avoided strategic defeat. Well, as you may have guessed, I think this is terribly, dangerously faulty reasoning. For one thing, the American government does not have the clear conventional and strategic superiority under which a threat of escalation could be made. Nor is it workable now, if it ever was, because of the increasing congressional limitations which restrict the so-called precise tuning or fine-tuning or precise controls that are required. We always have to bear in mind that we do not have a political system such as the Soviets in which we can escalate an American force when 2 or 3 people in Washington can do so, as 2 or 3 people in the Kremlin can do overnight. The military force that is political to us, however strong and however effective, will always remain a relatively blunt instrument. And it's absurd, really, to ignore these domestic political realities in an age of mass communications in a democratic society. The fatal flaw of these theories of the 50s, it seems to me, was their neglect of the domestic political realities of American democracy. I've always counseled against the indiscriminate use of our combat troops as a regular and customary part of our diplomatic efforts. They endanger the single most critical element of a successful democracy, which is a strong consensus and agreement for our basic purposes. I think a very profound principle of representative democracy is what, again, the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu described 2,000 years ago as moral influence. And by that he meant, as he said, that which causes the people to be in harmony with their leaders. Democratic governments derive their powers through consensus building, and some such consensus, in my judgment, has to underlie the formulation of all foreign policies, especially the use of force. Vietnam policy that we followed was not sustained by that consensus. There was a statement made by one of my predecessors, for whom I have great admiration and respect, who was here recently, former Defense Secretary McNamara, the longest-serving Defense Secretary. And he said, and this is a direct quotation, the greatest contribution that Vietnam is making, right or wrong is beside the point, is that it is developing an ability in the United States to fight a limited war, to go to war without the necessity of arousing the public ire. And I have to add, without the intention to win. And President Johnson soon found out, much to his regret, that the public ire was aroused. And the voice of America begins at the grassroots. And in effect, you can't do that, no matter how you try to hide it with enormous budgetary expenditures for domestic programs that are politically more popular and which, in my judgment, caused the beginnings of the inflation that we are only now trying to get hold of. In democracies, if you're going to use force, you have to mobilize, you have to sustain the national will. And this may be another of the real lessons of Vietnam. Hamilton in the Federalist Papers said that the Republican principle demands that the deliberate sense of the community should govern the conduct of those to whom they entrust the management of their affairs. And democracies, I think, are always led by force of persuasion and not by the persuasion of force. Democracy's beacon is not military force, but its devotion to human rights, to individual freedom. Leaders must have the courage to lead, and there must be a consensus from the people for any policy to succeed, no matter what what the issue is, no matter how right it may seem to specialists or to the leaders themselves. Our whole ability to influence foreign events may always be somewhat limited. It may be limited because this is a world that is torn by religions and social upheavals, and there is no violence quite as strong, no brutality quite as awful as that committed in the name of religious differences. Violence in many parts of the world is really endemic now, and we cannot, of course, get into everything. This certainly doesn't signal a slackening of our global responsibilities. Isolationism never was and never can be a practical model for American foreign policy. We can and we must intervene when it is vital to our national interest to do so, but it must be vital for our national interests. And then we must do it with sufficient strength to secure that national interest. So an American strategy that relies on the very sharp instrument of military and economic assistance, along with other factors that I've mentioned, I think is much more likely to command public support than repeated reliance on the use of American combat troops. This was understood and by many, and those who do understand these options should also, I think, recognize that the effect of their opposition to the security and economic options is more likely to increase the possibility that we would then have to use the very blunt instrument of military force to salvage vital American interests, which would be far more difficult after a situation had been allowed to run its course. The single most critical element of a successful democracy is and has to be a strong consensus of support and agreement for our basic purposes. And so one of these 6 tests that I used was that there should be some reasonable assurance of support of the American people and their elected representatives in Congress when they've been presented with all the facts. At the same time, I sought to reaffirm the primacy of the executive, the president, the elected leader of the United States, the only person elected by all of the people. He's commander-in-chief, and he has to have his authorities to move when a situation calls for rapid action. His has to be the prerogative to defend the vital interests at all times, and sometimes this can only be done if we move decisively and very, very quickly. The long, drawn-out debate in Congress over the merits of a U.S. rescue operation in Grenada would have doomed that operation to failure, and I think, in all likelihood, would have doomed the 1,000 American students, rather than enable us to rescue the students and make Grenada the complete success that it was. Congress, without any criticism, is not a decision-making body in times of crisis. The President's authority as Commander-in-Chief has to be clear and usable in times of real crisis. This does not alter his responsibility to consult with the Congress and report to the Congress. And even in the gray area of national security affairs, the Founding Fathers expected the two political branches to cooperate. They really must, for without the resources, which can come only from the Congress, strategies are really just empty sales. In critical situations, the President must have the flexibility to act rapidly, decisively, and both our friends and our foes should know this. So the aspect of the War Powers Act, which most concerns me in this connection, is the possibility of a situation in which Congress, under the statute, which we believe unconstitutional, could, within a fixed period of time, order our troops to withdraw from a situation in which troops have been committed by the President. And sometimes troops engaged in combat, or even situations in which they're not actually engaged in combat, can find it very dangerous, not really very safe, to disengage on a fixed timetable. Congressionally mandated fixed time limits are well understood by our adversaries, and they can shape their behavior accordingly, often to the great detriment of our nation's security and our soldiers' safety. World situations just don't accommodate themselves to fixed 30-day, 60-day, 90-day congressional withdrawal timetables. So the War Powers Resolution, which was inspired, understandably, by our ill-fated involvement in Vietnam, has resulted in Congress trying to limit executive authority, somehow in the belief that a weakened president and a weakened presidency and a more assertive legislature would one way or another produce a more judicious foreign policy. But congressional advocates have based their case from the War Powers Act on basically historically dubious assumptions and really a rather, I think, flawed understanding of the Constitution. They assumed, the congressional drafters of the War Powers Act, that the war powers, the ability or the authority to deploy American armed forces to defend our interests, belonged by right to the legislative branch, despite the fact, as one congressman declared at the time, that presidents have assumed it from the time of Washington. The War Powers Resolution thus started out, I think, under a basically mistaken theory. And it simply takes powers, according to the congressional sponsors, allegedly usurped by the president and restores them to the legislative branch. And that's a very comfortable assumption for the Congress to make. Senator Javits, who was one of the driving forces behind the War Powers Resolution, said the president has no authority to employ the nation's armed forces without explicit congressional permission. He said a president is commander-in-chief, period, nothing more. Well, I persist in the view that this view is seriously mistaken. I think in following it, Congress sets out on really a revolutionary redesign of the constitutional balance of powers with apparently little awareness of how seriously it jeopardizes our nation's ability to defend our interests abroad. And I think it's especially appropriate in this year of the Constitution's bicentennial to recall the framers' reasons for placing primary responsibility for international affairs in the hands of the President. It's clear that they had a far different view of presidential power than the legislators who enacted the War Powers Resolution. And Hamilton, whom you would expect to be on that side, argued in the Federalist Papers that the prime characteristic of the presidency is energy. And he meant by that, as he defined it, the capacity for prompt and unambiguous action, and the conduct of foreign affairs, indecision, delay, frequent shifts in the nation's policies, quickly dispirit its allies and show a weakness that only invites aggression from adversaries. Hamilton understood that the president's capacity to act with energy followed from a power of a unitary executive to speak in a single authoritative voice. in sharp contrast to the Congress, where debate and due deliberation rather than decisive action are that branch's special virtues. Even Jefferson, who was the arch rival of Hamilton and the arch rival of the Federalists, and well known for his wariness of executive power, assumed the president's primacy in international affairs. He just took it as a given. He said, "The transaction of business with foreign nations is executive altogether." This was a letter that he wrote to Washington in 1790. "Executive powers," he said, "belong to the head of that department, except such portions of it as are specifically submitted to the Senate." Exceptions, which he said are to be construed very strictly. Ratification of treaties, confirmation of presidential appointments, and so on. And when Jefferson became president a decade later, he didn't hesitate to use his full executive powers, whether to authorize the Louisiana Purchase or dispatch the U.S. Navy to defend against Barbary pirates or refuse to spend money that the Congress appropriated for gunboats that he didn't think were necessary. He didn't think they were necessary because the war had ended. Part of the tremendous political and practical wisdom of the founders, I think, was their understanding that, as John Adams said in his very famed formulation that's almost a cliche now, ours is a government of law and not of men. We cannot legislate for every conceivable circumstance. And nowhere is this more true or more evident, I think, than in the realm of international affairs, where conditions can change with little or no warning, overnight or sometimes during the night, usually during the night, or where near instant adjustments in policy are necessary, and where the very swift action of a single leader can quite literally be the difference between defeat and victory. So it seems to me that if we can follow these tests or something like them, that we can achieve the national consensus that is vital for the success of any policy in a free democratic country. And in the end, I think we should know that it is not the military strength of the United States that offers the greatest challenge to the Soviet Union or to other potential adversaries. It seems to me the greatest challenge we pose to them is that we have staked a claim on the future. We believe that political and economic liberty and individual freedom for all are not cliches, but are incomparably the world's best future. We hold these beliefs so strongly and so confidently that we put freedom constantly to the test, with our free press and our free elections and countless other ways in which we all too often take for granted. Together, they send a very clear signal to the peoples who are denied these basic principles in other parts of the world. They send a signal of confidence in ourselves, confidence in our beliefs, and in our hopes for a better way of life. And I think our democratic system prospers and inspires hope from the force of its ideas and values and not from the force of its arms. I think President Kennedy said more than 2 decades ago, quite correctly, that our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. It's not peace at the expense of freedom, but peace with freedom. And yet the paradox is that by vigilantly maintaining our military strength, a politically and often economically unpopular course, we think is the only way to ensure that these values will thrive, because we think strength is the price we pay for peace, and strength is the price we pay for freedom. Thank you very much.
Secretary Weinberger has consented to take some questions. There were 2 people upstairs, so with apologies to the people that are on the floor, whom I promised that since they didn't get to ask their question before, they could ask one if they wanted to, which was Leo, if you would like to use that microphone. You need to speak at the microphones because this is being taped for rebroadcast on public radio and perhaps public television. So
well, I felt right with you when you said that the leader of a country has to have the people behind him or her. And when you go to Russia as a visitor, you find or in the USSR, you find the people saying, peace, peace, peace. We're the ones that talk peace. You in the United States are the ones who talk war. Why don't the leaders there have to have the people behind them? We think their leaders are warlike, I think.
Well, you have a situation there. It's a very good question. You have a situation there in which public opinion does not play any role or any part in the government or in the policies. And It is one of the things we have to keep in mind at all times. It gives them only one advantage. It gives them innumerable disadvantages. It gives them a military advantage. It gives them the opportunity for a few people, 3, 4, 5 men, to sit around a table in the Kremlin and decide how much they're going to spend for the next 5 years on defense, the ability to change it overnight, the ability to take actions with respect to the acquisition of overseas bases, the ability to take other actions that we might find very harmful to our national security interests, the ability to modernize and strengthen forces on a regular basis. Right now, they are working on, for example, the follow-ons to their systems that they only started to deploy last year. We cannot do any of those things without lengthy, protracted public debate, and we should not be able to. But they can talk peace. They can utilize all of the channels that give them a world propaganda benefit. And if people are not aware of the realities, of the number of times they've talked this way and haven't followed those policies, things of that kind, they are impressed. And they can be dangerously impressed, as has happened many times in our past. So I think what we really come down to is the fundamental basic problem that in a society that has no public opinion, and in a society where there are really no freedoms, in a society where, as I mentioned earlier today, the permission of the Soviet Union for one of their most brilliant scientists to travel 600 miles in his own country is front-page headline news, then you can, in effect, talk peace and pretend that you are the principal force that is urging peace and that we have warlike aims, whereas from the point of view of our government, our leaders, our policy, we don't have warlike aims, but we have an enormous necessity of preserving the peace and defending against aggression, which is a very much more difficult military task than having an aggressive intention.
Over here on the left microphone.
Yeah. Last month, former Secretary of State Alexander Haig was here and was interviewed by Marvin Kalb. And Mr. Kalb asked the Secretary at that time if he had ever referred to you as incompetent. And he replied, and I quote, "There's no question I had some frustration about Weinberger, who in the early days of the administration wanted to be Secretary of State. Maybe," Haig went on to say, "that's why we have that zoo over there in the Pentagon where millions of taxpayers' dollars are being squandered." In the tradition of equal time and the right of editorial reply, I'd like to know what your response is to General Haig's assertion that millions of dollars were squandered at the Pentagon during your tenure there, and two, what state would you expect the White House to be in 2 years from now if General Haig is elected president?
I have counted to 10, and I resist the temptation. With respect to squandering of money, all I can remember and say is that Al Haig was extremely supportive of our defense budgets and always urged that we come in with higher requests than we did. And I thought this was supportive and helpful and reflective of his own knowledge of the requirements of the military. I think General Haig was a good soldier. He served the nation well. He had, as we all do, occasional aberrations, but that is the sort of thing that can happen to anybody in a democracy. But I don't think we wasted money in the Pentagon. The problem is we spent money on unpopular activities, and that is a difficult thing to do in a democracy that would infinitely rather not only not spend money on these things, but not even think about the very unpleasant facts of what is required to maintain the equations of deterrence and what are the various ratios of targets of the Soviet Union that we have to hold at risk to make sure they don't hold ours at risk, and all of these very unpleasant, very difficult, unpalatable truths. And it requires a lot of money, particularly after you have come out of a decade in which we did go down some 20%. It always costs more to recover than it does to maintain the forces required. But I just... No, I've now counted to 20, and I'm not going to say any more about that.
The right microphone.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you have articulated criteria for the use of conventional forces which emphasize public consensus and support. Should military forces be used in covert operations? And if so, what criteria should be applied?
Well, I think military forces have to be used from time to time in covert operations in the kind of world in which we live. We have had and been the victim of espionage since the beginnings of the Republic. And it is very nice to recall Secretary of War Stimson's forthright statement that gentlemen don't read other people's mail, and that's a policy I would love to be able to adhere to. But they're not all gentlemen in this world, and we can find ourselves in very serious peril if we don't have activities that enable us to find out what our enemy plans, what our potential adversaries' strengths, what are their capabilities, what are ways in which they might overtake us very suddenly. We have been overtaken suddenly within my lifetime, and it was a very disagreeable Sunday and a very disagreeable 4 years thereafter. And we don't obviously ever want to subject the American people to that again. Sometimes by covert action you can secure very substantial results with very small expenditures and with very little risk. And the criteria is a very critically important thing. And I do think that you should have well-defined goals, well-defined rules, which we had and which we now have again, in which the formal presidential findings required to launch covert actions are subject to scrutiny by appropriate members of the Congress, and that they are knowledgeable about them. The very nature of covert action is that you have to have the smallest number of people involved, because otherwise the people involved in it can be at very great risk, and the policies of the country can be completely lost and subverted. There are limited times. It ought to be done carefully, under very strict guidance, and with rules that ensure that it can't be used idly or irresponsibly or lightheartedly. And it is, I think, the kind of basic structure that we have now and should always have had.
Up here in the left balcony.
Yes, you cited the attack on Libya and the current situation in the Persian Gulf as examples where a military action was needed and justified. Yet reaction in Europe to the attack on Libya was largely negative, and they've certainly been less than completely supportive in our efforts in the Persian Gulf. And how do you account for this European reaction?
Well, I wouldn't agree with you completely. We had some very strong support in Europe. We had a lot of worry. A lot of people were very startled at the beginning, and there were a number of difficulties involved. Opinion polls in England, for example, were negative, but not overwhelmingly so. Opinion polls in France were very favorable. This was within a week or so after the action. As time went on, a lot of the perception changed, and as time continued to go on, and Libya did not commit overtly aggressive actions, more and more opinion seemed to swing around to the belief that it had been necessary and important. Remember, again, not only was it done reluctantly, but the circumstances in which it was done. It was only done after it was clearly established, I think without any slight equivocation, that the Libyan government had been directly and personally responsible for the bombing of a cafe, I believe it was, in Berlin, in which American lives were lost and many other lives were lost and many more lives were threatened. It was in a sense, the first absolutely clearly established use of terrorism, proven terrorism by a foreign government. And I think it was essential to respond very quickly. I have to consider, as we do under those circumstances, I had to consider the cost of not doing it. And the cost of not doing it, I think, would have been extraordinarily heavy. It would have demonstrated to the world that acts of terrorism of a particularly brutal kind could be committed, could be found out, could be discovered, could be proven, and no response would have. And so I think it was a justified action, and I think it basically fitted the tests that it was done as a last resort, because anyone who has dealt with the Libyan government understands perfectly well that it's run by a madman, and that is essential to have in mind. Yeah.
Yes. As Secretary of Defense, you are known for taking a hands-off policy when it came to reform of the military establishment and in the development of military strategy. Was that because you were satisfied with the defense establishment structure and with the armed services planning? or is it because you did not believe it is the role of the Secretary of Defense to become involved in these areas?
Well, neither. I don't think I did take a hands-off policy. And I think if you consulted with any of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Chiefs of Services or the Service Secretaries, that you would find they would agree with you. They were quite unhappy with some of the interventions and the roles that we did take. I do have a basic philosophy of management and government, starting with the first positions that I held, that the people whom you hold responsible for carrying out policies should be given the freedom to act and the resources to act, but not without supervision, not without very careful examination of whether they're doing things that person entrusted temporarily with those responsibilities, which I had feel should be done. And if they're not, I had no hesitancy and did many times intervene to change their path. There was also a prevalent feeling that we gave the services everything they requested in the way of financial resources. And again, this would come as a total surprise to a great many of the chiefs of those services and the service secretaries, who were regularly and repeatedly turned down in requests for things that they wanted that we either couldn't afford or that we felt were not a proper priority for that given situation. So I have to think that this is a good bit of a myth, and so I'm not dodging your question. I'm simply challenging and objecting to its fundamental assumption that I did start out with this kind of belief. I never did. I think what was confusing to some seemed to be that we did think that there should be more authority given to the people whom you ask to do these tasks. That is the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Air Force, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Secretaries of Army, Navy, Air Force, and so on. They should have responsibilities and they should have authority. But it is very carefully supervised authority, and it is only authority to act within resources which we in the Defense Department allocate them. And that indeed is the duty and the task of the Secretary, and it's one that I like to think I fulfilled. I may be prejudiced, of course.
We're back here on the left floor.
Mr. Secretary, how do you respond to the accusations that you have usurped some of the due power of your successors and of Mr. Reagan's successor by saddling them with so many ongoing big-ticket projects that they have no choice but to establish a level of defense spending higher than they might normally want to, or scrap costly programs or cut back on readiness?
Well, the President and my immediate successor were participants. We all agreed on the need for starting those programs and indeed bringing them to fruition as quickly as possible. And many of them have come to fruition. Many of them would be far better completed if the resources necessary to do so were voted, because there has not been really any serious dispute about the need for these programs. When there was serious dispute, we examined it very carefully, and even though very large amounts had been invested, if we were convinced that a program was not going to work out, I didn't hesitate to cancel it, and I did that 2 or 3 times, once with a very big public program called the DIVAD, the Division Air Defense. But the requirements of starting these programs seemed to us to be, and I certainly include the present Secretary of Defense, who was Undersecretary at the time many of these started, and who was in full agreement, and the President, who was in full agreement, that we had to do them. For one thing, we had to modernize all 3 elements of the triad of our strategic defense at once. A very unfortunate thing, and something that we should not have had to do. We should have had the modernization of the ICBM leg, and we certainly should have had the modernization of the old B-52s, now 27 years old, and we needed a submarine launched missile that had the accuracy and the yield to destroy Soviet hardened targets that had been hardened since we last approached the construction of a missile. So we did what we really had to do. You always have to do more when you have had 10 years in which you have gone down so far and declined to do it. All kinds of deferred maintenance had to be done. Major improvements in the quality of life of the troops had to be installed if we wanted to keep a volunteer system. And having seen what tears in the social fabric a draft caused, I was the last one who wanted to go back to the draft. And so we did a lot of things. We had to. I don't look at it as a bow wave. I look at it as a very essential and very fortunate thing that Congress was willing to support, the strength that we added in those years from 1981 to 87. And there is still a lot in the pipeline. And the Soviets are very much aware of that. And that's why we have an INF treaty.
We're back here to the right-hand microphone. Mr. Secretary, you've spoken of the importance of maintaining U.S. foreign policies which would minimize the chances of U.S. military intervention. Do you not feel that past U.S. policies of nearly unqualified support for authoritarian regimes such as the Shah of Iran, the Somoza family, the Marcos regime in the Philippines, and most recently the Duvalier regime in Haiti have led to precarious situations which might then require some sort of military intervention?
No, I really don't. I think one of the greatest mistakes we made was to fail to support the Shah at a time when he most needed the help. A lot of people worried about the repressive government of the Shah. What we have seen is the most repressive government since the Middle Ages. And this comes from a failure to consider the alternatives. We are not always going to be able to have the kind of allies or the kind of governments that we would like to support or 100%. But we have to consider what is the alternative. And if the alternative to a Shah, who is actually beginning to institute a number of Western reforms and for one thing had improved materially the quality of women in that Middle Eastern state, and had done a great deal for education and so on, with a lot of other things we didn't like very much. But if we had considered for one moment what the alternative to that was, as I say, this kind of totally repressive Middle Ages type of theocracy, and we were instrumental, I think, in helping to secure a change which I believe is very much for the better, although there is not yet full stability established there. So I think we have to look at these charges very carefully. There are a lot of people who thought that, and still think, that we shouldn't do anything in El Salvador because there are some unpleasant people in El Salvador's government and some unpleasant aspects to it. What's the alternative? The alternative is a communist-led guerrilla kind of government, which, if it succeeded, would establish, in effect, another Cuba very close to our mainland. So these are the alternatives we have to consider. In considering them and making our choices, and in thinking about whether one is better or worse than the other, we don't have to give up our principles, and we don't have to give up constantly trying to improve the governments that we support. That's what we've done in the Philippines, it's what we've done in El Salvador, and it's what I hope we can continue to do. It's what we have no chance to do in Iran.
Could you comment on Haiti as well, the Duvalier regime in Haiti?
Well, again, the Duvalier regime in Haiti was not one that was particularly supported by us in the current administration. Over the years, his father of Duvalier had been supported. The alternatives were not in any sense visible, and there were a lot of people who, I think, as it turned out quite improperly, felt that the kind of looting of the public treasury to support a number of people and reduce their condition of poverty was not too bad an idea. I never felt that, and I don't think the administration ever felt that. But again, there was no attempt to shore up that regime. There was no attempt to keep that regime in power. In fact, quite the contrary, and we went to lengths that some of us considered almost unnecessary in trying to find some place where Duvalier could be shipped off to. Nobody wanted him, and that made it a little more difficult. But we have a substitute government down there. It is still a long way from stability, and they even had to cancel an election, or did cancel an election. Whether it was proper or not, I wouldn't venture to say. But I don't think we are guilty of or properly accused of supporting for too long a government which quite evidently had become totally unrepresentative and manifestly corrupt.
Mr. Secretary, I'm curious about your evaluation of President Reagan's support for the Contras in Nicaragua, considering first your denunciation of terrorism and also your tests, as you call them, which mandate that we not only specify a clear and vital goal, but that we act quickly and effectively to achieve that goal. And also, I guess, just based on your comment on the last question, whether or not a return to the Somoza regime would be the lesser of the evils than taking a less than perfect ally like the Sandinista government.
Well, I certainly don't think a return to the Somoza regime would be a good thing, and we supported the Sandinista rebellion against the Somozas and did it very properly, I think. What the problem is, I'm afraid you assume that the Contras are Samoistas, and they are not. They are people who, for the most part, participated in the revolution. For the most part, were part of the Sandinistas and were denied the freedoms for which they fought, for which they were promised. There is not really freedom of speech and freedom of press and freedom of worship in Nicaragua, though they're starting to make some slight progress towards it. But the Contras are not a group of murderers who were supporters of Somoza. They are people who basically participated in the revolution, who basically were promised a great many freedoms and civil rights, none of which they were granted, and who to this day are not really able to go home very safely. So I think what we're doing in Nicaragua is entirely proper in supporting people in fighting for their own freedom. There is a perhaps even more practical aspect to it, and that is that the government, the Sandinista government, is manifestly anti-U.S., is manifestly the same general persuasion as the Cuban government, and the Cuban government makes quite more complicated the defense of continental United States, not because we worry about a Cuban invasion or any nonsense like that, but because they are a very strong intelligence gathering, listening post, Soviet base, from which our reinforcement convoys, should we have to go to NATO, can be harassed, and which can harass and interfere with a substantial amount of our required merchant shipping. And that is not the kind of situation that we can really work with very easily, to have that kind of a Soviet base so close to our own homeland. But the real reason that we are doing what we're doing in Nicaragua is essentially to help people help themselves in fighting for their own freedom. And people frequently say, but the Contras have killed so many people here, there, and elsewhere. Well, war is a very unpleasant business, and it is why we should be very careful about the use of our own troops. And in wars, people do get killed. In the American Revolution, people got killed, and in every war they do. But what you have with the Contras, for the most part, and certainly not 100%, is a group of people who joined in the original revolution, who were promised and now denied their freedoms, and who are fighting to regain them. And I think it's proper to support them.
A quick follow-up.
Do you think that President Reagan's program of working through the Contras to try and overthrow the government, if that is the purpose, is effective, or can it be effective?
I don't think that is the purpose. I don't think we're trying to overthrow the government. We have said many times that what we want is pluralism. What we want is these people to be allowed to come home freely without being thrown into jail or murdered. And there are some 7,000 people down there and political prisoners without any charges or anything else being held. And we don't want to overthrow the government. We want the government to modify and change its behavior so that there will be a chance for a real democracy and these rights to be achieved. We're not trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. We're trying to help the Contras secure the freedom within the government that they're fighting for.
Back there in the right now.
Mr. Weinberg, last May in an editorial published in the San Francisco Chronicle, you wrote that a comprehensive test ban would undermine U.S. national security. You wrote, and I quote, "The fact is that as long as we must rely on nuclear weapons to deter Soviet aggression, nuclear testing will be essential if we are to maintain the safety, reliability, effectiveness, and survivability of our warheads and weapons systems." In an accompanying editorial, Nobel physicist and nuclear pioneer Owen Chamberlain argued that unreliability in fact increases national security, because unreliability increases the threshold for the uses of nuclear weapons. My question is that if nuclear reliability paradoxically increases instability and lowers the threshold of the use of nuclear weapons, does not the Reagan policy of continued nuclear testing make the use of nuclear weapons more likely?
Well, I could really not accept Owen's formulation. I never felt there was any usefulness in unreliability from a number of points of view. And one of them is anyone with even the slightest familiarity with the effects of any kind of nuclear explosion would not want it to be unreliable or to be uncertain as to whether it could be controlled or not allowed to occur. I would not change a word of that editorial or column actually that I wrote, because I believe very firmly that as long as you do have to rely on nuclear weapons, you do have to know that they work. I can't imagine any more unstable situation in which you had a lot of potential nuclear explosions sitting around waiting to happen without anybody having any direction or control or ability to stop it or control it. What we're trying to get is the kind of world in which we have much less reliance on nuclear weapons. And indeed, we're about to sign a treaty which we, because of our insistence and strong and I may say stubborn negotiating posture, have now secured that eliminates a complete class of nuclear weapons. It leaves a lot of others. It doesn't end war, but it does accomplish a very great number of objectives. And the reason we got that is not because the SS-20 was unreliable or because the Pershing II, we never knew when it would work or not. It was because they were weapons that when we deployed ours, the Soviets regarded it as a sufficient incentive to agree to take out all of theirs, after saying many times in 6 or 7 different ways they never would. But I cannot imagine anything that would be less responsible or less conducive to stability than a reliance on the unreliability of untested weapons, which with their potential for world destruction is so enormous that you simply have to know whether or not they are going to work. And you also have to test to know what the capabilities and what the likelihood of the Soviets are and what forms of defenses can be effective. So the answer to trying to eliminate or reduce the reliance on nuclear weapons is not to make them more unreliable. You have to test them. The answer is to try to eliminate the need for them in the first place.
Back here to the left microphone.
You have attacked the War Powers Act as unnecessarily interfering with the President's flexibility to deploy forces. And in so doing, you followed the doctrine of original intent by citing a few of the Founding Fathers and how they viewed presidential authority. But you neglected to discuss the plain language of the Constitution, which in Article 1 gave Congress, and Congress alone, the power to declare war. If a president can bomb Libya, invade Grenada, or assemble a flotilla in the Persian Gulf without prior congressional authorization, what in heaven's name would be something that would require prior congressional authorization? Or can a president, if she so chooses, in the name of flexibility, do anything she desires without Congress's consent?
Well, it's interesting that you should utilize the presidential feminine pronoun, but this may be because some of our strongest leaders and most prone to use military force have been women. But it is essential, I think, that we recognize that there are a lot of conditions short of declarations of war. We've had very, very few declarations of war in our history. We've had many, many situations which required immediate response, or they would lead to declarations of war and worse. And so what I'm talking about are these situations in which the executive power, which I believe was clearly understood and defined and granted by the Founding Fathers, is essential to be exercised and not to be fettered by a fixed timetable, which is the equivalent of holding all of your plans and requirements up for the enemy to see and to let their actions be governed accordingly. There are declarations of war situations. These are clearly, as you say, under the Constitution required to be voted by the Congress. But there are many situations short of that which can indeed prevent or lead to the lack of necessity for a declaration of war if we take firm and decisive executive action. In the Persian Gulf, we do not have anything at this point that is a combat situation for the United States. We've sent some, I guess it was 18 convoys through when I left, and I think there have been 1 or 2 more since, that previously were subject to major attacks. They're ships that carry the American flag, and they're ships that therefore are entitled to the protection that we've always given our ships since our beginnings as a nation. And to refuse to give that support, or to do it only if we declared war on Iran, seem to me to be both very undesirable options.
But are there any wars that would require a congressional declaration
Oh,
of war.
indeed.
You haven't named any examples yet of a war.
Oh, World
that
War
would
II,
require
World
prior
War
authorization.
I, all of those. They absolutely required. They were real wars, and I participated in one of them. I think it was the second one. But we had no. There are plenty of situations. Fortunately, there are also, or not fortunately, but there are also a number of very ambiguous situations short of that, and situations in which prompt action can prevent that. And that's what we want to take.
First of all, thank you for coming here. It's a privilege to hear you. You alluded in your remarks to the importance of us being aware of the variety of threats that face us. Several weeks ago, there was a remarkable article in the Wall Street Journal that suggested that on Black Monday, we came within minutes of a complete breakdown of our financial system. First of all, do you subscribe to the notion that political instability grows out of economic instability? And secondly, do you acknowledge an internal threat that we may face growing out of potential instability in our economic system relating to our fiscal policy and the twin deficits?
Well, there are all manner of threats lurking everywhere all the time. I don't think that we have anything remotely resembling a situation of the kind you described with the fact that the market went down. I personally think the market is an extraordinarily bad indicator of economic strength and economic stability. Look at all the other indices, which I think are much better. Unemployment is down, employment is up, the gross national product is growing at a reasonable rate. Inflation is about more than a third of what it was when we took office. The inventories are low, which has a great deal to do with the future orders and the future examination of the future activity of the economy. I think the stock market is an extraordinarily, unnecessarily volatile activity that is roughly the equivalent of a large row of birds on a telephone wire who, when a pebble is dropped, all fly off in one direction, and then they come back. It is possible. It is possible that we can talk ourselves into a much more serious situation than we have. If people think that because the stock market went down 500 points, they should therefore stop buying, they should change all of their habits, they should do any one of a number of things that can lead to economic problems, then you could have some trouble. But the market itself going down, for which there was no basic reason except, I think, these new computerized sales types of things in which everybody tries to get ahead of everybody else in predicting what the market is going to do, shouldn't be taken as an indication of fundamental weakness in the economy. The other half of your question, is it possible that we could cause ourselves some problems if we got into economic trouble? Yes, of course it is. And we see now a rather belated concern about the deficit, which unfortunately is taking itself out in a typical standard solution of cutting the least popular programs and expanding the most popular programs, which is not going to cure the deficit. We could cause ourselves serious harm. But I don't think that harm would come, nor do I think it will come, from the economic policies of the administration, because I think the tax cuts unleashed a great deal of the enormous energy and vigor of the economy, and are largely responsible for its great buoyancy. And of course, I have to say that I don't think a high defense budget is bad for the economy. I don't think you should ever increase defense spending to help the economy. I, as was said in another occasion, am not a Keynesian, but I do think that you have to recognize that adequate defense spending not only helps the security of the country, but isn't bad for the economy. And if you think a high defense budget is bad for the economy, you ought to try a defense budget that requires 400,000 soldiers to be put out on the economy within a year. And that's what some of the Graham-Rudman requirements might lead us to.
Just a very short call. 1 to 10, how serious would you say the twin deficits are?
The deficits?
Yeah.
I think the deficits are very unfortunate and are not very not a good policy to follow. I think they were easily controllable. I suppose I would say on a scale of that, they're roughly somewhere in the 5 to 6, if you want to try to quantify it. But it's just a pure guesswork on my part. But the deficits could easily be controlled, and the way to control them is simply not politically popular, and that is to cut back on a lot of basically unnecessary and completed domestic spending, which have big constituencies, and at the same time to make sure that you have an adequate, reasonable, say 3% annual growth in the investment in the security of the country, and a very reasonable, adequate growth in foreign assistance, foreign economic aid, and foreign military assistance. And your deficit will come down. As I mentioned earlier today, every time the defense budget was cut, the deficit went up. Every time. And that's because when you cut the defense budget, you gave the impression to a lot of people that this freed a lot of money, which they could then put into buying more constituent support. And that's essentially what a lot of the domestic programs do, not all of them by any means. But that is the way basically to deal with the deficit. We've had dire predictions of all the terrible things that would happen to the country if we continued with deficit spending. And as a much younger man, I used to make many of those predictions. But I have to say that we've had now not just 7 years, but many, many more years than that of deficits, and the economy has rarely been stronger. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's the way to get a strong economy, and I would like to reduce them. But I think that it is not worth endangering or imperiling the security of the country to get a tidier balance sheet.
I'm sorry to the people that are still up, but the local work rules here say that we have to stop at 9:30. The Secretary may be willing to take your questions here at the front after if you'll hurry down. But on behalf of the Harvard audience, we want to thank you very much.